Gauteng government, in partnership with the Centre for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, has hosted a discussion on community responses to gender-based violence. That's after the centre conducted research about sexual violence and responses to it in 8 communities. To discuss all of this, I'm joined by Annah Moyo-Kupeta, who's the Executive Director of the CSVR and Merita Ground, who's the Coordinator of Gauteng Provincial GBV and Femicide Program. Thank you both so much for your time this evening. We do appreciate it. Merita, let me just start with you. Many times we are told that the community also needs to play an active role in bringing an end to GBV and calling out those who participate in this. Are we seeing a difference, and are we seeing a different message sent to these communities and community members who partake in these horrific crimes?
So yes, we do focus on the idea that the community should take collective responsibility for reporting GBV incidents, and also to react, to be preventative and reactive. And I believe we do. This report that has been put together by CSVR in partnership with Gauteng Provincial Government went to the community, spoke to community members, and the solutions that is coming forth from here are community driven. So in short, the answer is yes, communities are ready to stand up and to be a collective part to fight against gender-based violence and femicide.
Anna, maybe I can bring you in here, where we know that this research was conducted looking at 7 Gauteng-based communities. And these communities that have been listed, for example, Orange Farm, Diepsloot, Kagiso, Alex, Mayfair. These are areas that are often highlighted in the media where you have these horrific crimes happening. I mean, this happens across the country, but these are some of the hot spots here in Gauteng. What has this research highlighted and perhaps found?
Thank you. Indeed, you are right. The communities that we have focused on for this report are communities where issues of gender-based violence have come up a lot, and some of them have been identified as the GBV hotspots by Minister Begitsele. So our research focused on highlighting the root causes of gender-based violence, as well as some of the key drivers of this violence in communities, in order to come up with solutions that are informed by the lived realities of women, what is happening in the communities, the interface by women of this violence, and with the intersections of GBV with other forms of violence, for instance, and other issues, your socioeconomic issues in the communities. So amongst the root causes, there has been a number of issues such as structural violence, for instance, what we also have called in this report slow violence, violence that happens over a long period of time, manifesting either as environmental violence or some of the violence, for instance, that is coming to the fore, resulting for some of the constitutions of these communities in the townships, how the communities came to be, how they were constituted, and how, for instance, they got to exist. So all of this interplaying into and feeding into the gender-based violence dynamic that we are experiencing in the country. So your issues like alcohol abuse have also come up in a number of these communities as some of the key drivers of gender-based violence. Issues such as childhood trauma, for instance, have also come up as some of the root causes of gender-based violence, where men have seen this violence growing up, their parents being violent against one another. They've seen their mothers being beaten up by their fathers, and this has translated into that intergenerational trauma, the childhood trauma playing itself out in their own relationships now as fathers, as husbands in the now. So these are some of the outcomes that have come out of this research. But also, most importantly, is also the intersections, for instance, how some of the definitions that we use around gender-based violence also can be present at the same time within a specific community, within a victim's life, and within a family structure. For instance, intimate partner violence, domestic violence can all happen to one person at the same time. Structural violence issues driven by unemployment, driven by lack of prospects, for instance, driven by poverty, etc., have also come to the fore, highlighting the fact that if we are really to address the issue of gender-based violence in South Africa, we have to dig deep and go to addressing the root causes of this violence and deal with issues that are entrenched in our society, in our cultures, in our religions of patriarchy. Then we can start the hard work of transforming norms, attitudes, beliefs that we have that sometimes normalizes gender-based violence, so that we don't see it as gender-based violence, but we see it as normal relating with our spouses, with our partners, and with people in our lives, particularly men. And therefore, we really have a lot of work that we need to invest in, from addressing the root causes to the key drivers of gender-based violence in the country. And we unpack all of these different types of violence that feed into the gender-based violence narrative that also manifest as gender-based violence in this report.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you've touched on a number of very important aspects that we'll try and get into. But I want to bring Merita in here and ask about what the response has been from communities. Because oftentimes, you know, we have these dialogues, we have these conversations, but it's mostly about action plan now. It's mostly about trying to find a way to deal with GBV, especially because it comes from our communities, the hearts of our communities. Unfortunately, oftentimes when we sit in court, we hear about how it's the neighbor or the boyfriend or the ex-boyfriend or whoever it might be. And that might be speaking to a different kind of message that we need to be sending out about bringing an end to GBV. And perhaps communities are just not responding or hearing it properly, or maybe they're just tired of dialogue.
I believe that dialogue could always have a pertinent role to play, because that is how we then understand the lived realities as set out in the research report. A number of the issues that was mentioned by Anna speaks to the fact that our action plan will and must be based on the National Strategic Plan of Gender-Based Violence. The issues that are driving gender-based violence is beyond psychosocial matters as normally believed. This research study has indicated clearly that environmental design, structural design, economical issues, as well as poverty, has a direct link to violence and sexual gender-based violence and femicide in general. So what is the action plan? The action plan is to put the NSP on GBVF practically in place in these communities with the communities. So the 6 different pillars, and I'm just going to highlight a few of them. Pillar 1 speaks to accountability, coordination, and leadership. And when we engaged with these communities, we have collectively taken responsibility as state, civil society, corporate, and community leaders, and what one would refer to as just your normal community residents, to partake in Pillar 1, to take collective accountability, coordination, and leadership. We have found that from Pillar 2 that speaks to prevention, Pillar 3 that talks to justice, response, care, support, and healing, Pillar 4, and economic power, Pillar 5, that will now bring different spheres of state in. So it is not going to be your social cluster responding to gender-based violence and femicide in these specific areas. It is going to go to your economic cluster, to your justice cluster. It is not going to be a state-driven, neither a civil society activist-based driven approach. It's going to be an approach that is driven by what the community has brought forth as their lived realities, and what solutions they believe that we can collectively put in place to change the current narrative. It is important to note that this research study is the beginning of intervention within these 7 communities. So there will be a sustained 9-month program that CSVR Gauteng provincial government and all civil societies within that areas will embark on. And we will then have an impact study done to see if these 7 areas can then become the benchmark for what we do and how we create a new collective response to gender-based violence and femicide. We cannot ignore that gender-based violence is really beyond an individual matter. It is linked to the past, it is linked to the present realities, and those realities is becoming quite a pandemic and threatening not just the safety of women and children that are mostly affected, but the safety of just being a South African within a society that needs to prosper.
Certainly. Anna, I want to speak about an aspect that you touched on that I think plays a huge role oftentimes in how serious the cases of GBV that we see. And you mentioned childhood trauma as well as alcohol. And oftentimes when you move into these communities, having covered these stories and cases in courts, you often find that there is childhood trauma. I'm curious to know from your reports and analysis and research, having conducted this in these communities in Gauteng, if that was one of the prominent causes and links to GBV that we are seeing.
Indeed, it is one of the prominent features, even in the report. Issues of childhood trauma, issues of intergenerational trauma are playing out. And the dynamic around trauma is the fact that it is a root cause, but also it is a key driver of GBV. A root cause in the sense that when sons, for instance, or when children experience it in their childhood growing up, they are not able to process it. They've never been taken to places or to spaces where they can process their trauma, address it and deal with it, for instance. So it is that unresolved trauma that then runs in a person's life unchecked into their childhood. And now as an adult, even no matter the resolve that this man who now has children, who now has a wife, no matter the resolve that they have that I don't want to be like my father, I don't want to beat my wife like my father used to beat my mother. But because of the unresolved trauma and the complexities around intergenerational trauma, they find themselves engaged in the very same patterns that their parents were engaged in of violence. For instance, if their fathers used to beat their mothers, they'll find themselves beating their wives and not understanding why this pattern is continuing, for instance. And it all stems from trauma. The very thing that you don't want to become ends up being your response. But also as a key driver, when you are sitting with trauma that has been unresolved for a long time, it manifests differently. It manifests in your anger outbursts. It manifests, for instance, in you being intolerant. It manifests in being curt in your responses. It manifests in violence, basically. And this happens with the person not intending to be violent, but it's the manifestation of the unresolved trauma, the deep-seated trauma over the years that has been left untreated or unresolved, for instance. So as a key driver, it could be a woman speaks or does something wrong. Instead of finding more peaceful ways of engaging or relating, violence becomes the language, so to speak, of relating or of responding to something that you don't like, for instance. So it becomes also a key driver. But it takes someone going through a process of addressing their own trauma, dealing with their own trauma, to understand how it manifests, for instance, either as anger, as violence, as outbursts, etc., which then ends up actually leading to gender-based violence, particularly in how this man, for instance, relates with his wife or the women in his life, for instance. So it really comes in as a root cause, also as a key driver. And the issue of alcohol, also interestingly, in some of the communities like Diepsloot, for instance, it has come up a lot as also leading to issues of transactional sex particularly for women, where, for instance, after drinking, then or in order to access alcohol, which also is tied to some of the trauma, alcohol is being used to numb some of the socioeconomic ills and its impact on the lives of people. We've experienced COVID, for instance. Unemployment is at an all-time high. Issues, for instance, of poverty as well, and lack of access to opportunities. In order to try and numb some of these impacts, alcohol becomes sort of your go-to substance that helps people to numb some of the impacts of what they're experiencing by lack of these socioeconomic opportunities and services. Yeah. And as a result, then once the people have consumed alcohol, women then also, this is when transactional sex happens, and as transactional sex happens owing to alcohol, the women get raped that way. The men are not able to take a no, for instance. Everything becomes forced. The inhibitions, for instance, are also lowered by alcohol. So it becomes this vicious circle, yeah, where a lot of other issues come to the fore. A drunk man going to his home, finding that the food is not on the table, then you start shouting at your wife. When your wife tries to respond, you respond violently, hitting her, but you have no collection of it in the morning, or you're ashamed of this, of how you reacted, for instance. So it leads into this whole complex cycle of violence, particularly gender-based violence, that actually disproportionately gets meted onto women and girls, sure, in the lives, yeah, of men and boys in these communities.
Sure, definitely. Merita, let's perhaps just end off with you and speak about the importance of everybody coming together to try and bring an end to GBV. It's not just up to government or up to each individual, but it's also got to do with all stakeholders and maybe, yeah, each individual saying, I need to be a better person and not be part of this violent society that we live in.
Gauteng provincial government, therefore, during the 16 days, have a specific focus on men participating and becoming the narrative changes. As we speak today, we have moved out, and we do this 365 days a year, to taverns. Young women has gone out to taverns, chisanyamas, public outlets where men are, and engage them on what we need to do collectively as different genders to make sure that we fight this fight. So we've brought men in. That is the first one that is important to note. We've also noted the substance abuse matter, and therefore the Premier of Gauteng has put in place 2 weeks back a hotline to make sure that any family can call that hotline and make sure that people that are dependent on substance abuse that then leads to this type of violence are getting immediate assistance. The Gauteng provincial government has a war room that consists of community members, civil society, academia, research, and corporate. We hope that there could be more corporates coming on board because economic and poverty are really strong drivers of gender-based violence and femicide in our country. We believe that collectively we can really make a change. I think Gauteng has moved beyond dialogue. Gauteng is really uniting under the theme of connect, collaborate, and contract. So when we speak to you about a research that has been launched, we follow it up with an MOU between all of these collective parties, taking responsibility to make sure that we will all be accountable for change in our communities.
Okay, thank you both so much for your time. We do appreciate, and we also appreciate the work that you are doing, because hopefully it's going to make a positive difference and contribution to our communities. That was Annah Moyo-Kupeta and Merita Ground.